so, man, we're excited to dive into Ruth this morning. And so my name's Stephen. I'm the administrative pastor here at Parkview. And so we've been going through the book of Ruth. We're doing a chapter a week. And so this is our third week. So if you've got your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Ruth chapter 3. And so we're going to be diving in a little bit more today as we're just looking at this really interesting book. And so the book of Ruth has a lot of really good things in there. And so it's one of those books, I feel like lots of times if you read through it, maybe for the first time, you're like, what did I just read? I'm like, okay, it's kind of a weird story for us culturally, maybe, but we know that there are some main themes in there. And so, of course, the main theme for just the overarching theme of the book is just this idea of having a redeemer. And so more specifically, a kinsman redeemer, which again for us is weird. We do not have kinsman redeemers in our culture. And so a lot of times it might seem, again, out of context as a really strange read because it just seems maybe not applicable as far as some of the things that Ruth walked through, which is not true, but there is this really cool picture that we see in Scripture of something called a kinsman redeemer, or the Hebrew word is a goel, and that's what we see throughout the book. Another thing that we see that's, I think, really important when we look at the book of Ruth is this idea of a Gentile coming to the Lord. And so the book of Ruth is actually the most in-depth look we get of anyone, of any Gentile coming to the Lord, making God her God. And so I would say that is a huge theme of the book of Ruth and this idea of the kinsman redeemer. In fact, there's a lot of people who think that the book of Ruth is actually what Jesus was referring to when he tells this parable. He gives this parable, and what he says is there's this man who finds this treasure, and it's such a good treasure that he goes, he sells everything that he has, and he buys the whole field. Why? For the treasure that's in the field. And so a lot of people think that Jesus is actually referring to himself desiring the salvation for the Gentiles so much that he sees this great treasure in the exact same way that we'll see Boaz eventually. He buys a field, but we know that Boaz doesn't care about the field. Boaz cares what he gets when he buys the field, which is Ruth. And so it's a really important theme for us, is just this idea that God desires the Gentiles that much and to save them. And that's one of the things that in the Old Testament, and even early on in the Gospels, we see a lot of confusion from the Israelites, from the Jews, in this one area of just like, what is God's view of the Gentiles? And so now we know that it's been made very clear that God desires for all people to be saved. And it's also important to get that didn't just start once the New Testament happened. It wasn't Jesus died on the cross and now God's like, oh, now I love these people. No, God has always desired that. And any time we see someone else from another culture, from another race in the Old Testament truly turn and come to the Lord, he welcomes them with open arms. And so again, in the book of Ruth, we see that. It's never a race thing. It's always a religious separation thing. And so one of the reasons that was so confusing to the Jews is because there are a lot of Old Testament laws regarding religious separation. And so all throughout, they have to remain separate. Again, this is before Jesus sends the helper. Remember, Jesus says, look, I have to go away so I can send the helper to you. And then we see God's people empowered with the Holy Spirit in Acts and the rest of the New Testament. Well, before that, we see this religious separation of God saying, no, you need to remain separate from these other nations or you're going to go after their gods, which is exactly what has happened during this time period, is that the nation of Israel has absolutely started chasing after these other people's gods because they didn't remain religiously separate. So, before the book of Ruth, the only real good picture we see of a Gentile coming to know the Lord was Rahab. And so you might remember the story, just depending on how you've gone through Joshua, but remember Rahab was a Canaanite prostitute who lived in the city of Jericho. And what Rahab does is she ends up saying, I want to make God my God too. And she comes to the Lord and she ends up saving these spies. There's this great salvation for Israel. And lots of it has to do with Rahab having the courage to do that. But that's the best picture we've seen so far of an in-depth look of a Gentile coming to know God after the law has been given. And so already the Jews would have to know, all right, there's some type of accommodations here. And what I think is really interesting is we're going to put this genealogy on the screen from the book of Matthew. And so with this, I'll read it. It says, "And Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David the king." And so, again, this is just a snippet of a genealogy in Matthew, but already one of the things that we see really neat about this story is Boaz is actually connected to both of those women, right? We see where Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute who ended up coming to know the Lord, ends up being the mother of Boaz, who ends up marrying Ruth, the Moabite. And so I think contextually, that's an important thing. I know genealogies can be kind of a snoozer. Lots of people skip them when we're reading through the Bible, if we're going to be honest, right? But when we see that, we go, that's really cool to know, because I think when we're talking about Boaz, one of the things that's really interesting about this man is he seems to have this great understanding of God's heart for the Gentiles. One we don't ever see, and we say, well, why? Well, maybe because his mom's Rahab. And so even with this, there's some disagreement on, and some people say, well, they might have skipped a generation during Boaz's life, and Rahab wasn't his mom. And so some people think that, and I disagree. This actually lines up with the genealogy and Chronicles perfectly. But what happens is the book of Judges is weird as far as the timeline is concerned. And so what happens in the book of Judges is there's lots of regional judges that happen where a judge will be raised up over here against this country, and then they'll have peace for this many years. But over here in this part of Israel, at a completely different time, something happens. And so if you try to just add up the hey, there's rest for this many years, plus there's rest for this many years, then your timeline for the book of Judges gets messed up. And so with that, this actually helps us with the timeline, because we know Rahab was actually there for the first story in the conquest at Jericho. And so we know that the story of Ruth actually happens at the beginning of the book of Judges. And so that's kind of the time period we're in. And one of the first stories, by the way, in the book of Judges is about the Moabites and King Eglon and some of those other things. But that helps us with a few things. So if you fell asleep for the genealogy stuff, wake back up. And so, but I do think it's good that Ruth and Rahab have some similarities, right? Where they are both Gentiles, meaning they've both been raised in pagan culture. So they weren't raised around all of this Jewish law. And by the way, the Jewish law hasn't been around for that long, just a few generations at this time. And so it's even still weird for lots of the Israelite people, but that's where they're coming from. And so another thing they have in common is both women, I would say, have a incredible amount of discernment. Both of those women, Rahab and Ruth, are able to see the truth. And I think that's something that's really important that we get in all of this. For whatever reason, God has revealed truth to them, and that truth literally sets them free, both in a spiritual way, where they both make God their God and they're saved spiritually, but also because of that truth, they're both rescued from something on this side of heaven because they make God their God. And so focusing in on Ruth here, when Ruth starts, she in the story, she's going through some bad circumstances, like awful. Like she marries into this family, and then just there's tragedy immediately. The father's dead. Then her husband and his brother die just immediately in that story. And so we don't see what all leads up to it, but we just see tragedy in the life of Ruth. But what we see as a result of that is that Ruth makes God her God. And that's a really interesting thing. We don't see that a lot from these other Gentile cultures. But you remember back in chapter 1, she says to Naomi, she says, your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. And she's not just saying that. We also see that, like, no, she's living that way. She starts living by biblical principles. And so the first thing we see is that as Ruth makes God her God, is she's living this sacrificial love that she has for Naomi. Like, it's so obvious that she's trying to live the right way. She has this life that I would say is dedicated to hard work. Again, another biblical principle that's really important for us is just hard work. Do all things as for the Lord and not for men. And so she's doing that. She's working hard. She's in the fields making sure she's providing. And then in today's passage, what we're going to see is that she also truly listens to and takes godly counsel. And maybe even more importantly is that she starts following the Jewish laws. And so that's another thing that I think is really important when we start talking about the life of Ruth, is like, no, she makes God her God. And in the Old Testament context, it also means that she's going to start following those Jewish laws. And so let's read Ruth chapter 3, and we'll dive in a little bit more after that. So here it is. It says, then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, all that you say I will do. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good. Let him do it. But if he's not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it out, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city, and when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. She replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. So that's a lot. That's a whole chapter, but let's look at some of these things through just the lens of Ruth here, some takeaways for what it starts to look like as she's trying to live now a godly life. So here's number 1. It's that godly laws make provision for the needy. Godly laws make provision for the needy. And so just as a capitalist, sometimes I forget that, right? But here we see that, man, these godly laws are really important to Ruth, and they actually help take care of her. And so we've already seen this back in chapter 2, where Ruth is gleaning in the field. And so part of the law for the landowners in the Old Testament, and so if you're a landowner, then when your workers are going through the fields, they were not allowed to pick up every single scrap they had to leave those scraps. Why? Well, it was a provision for the poor. So that way the poor could come through and they would have something to eat. And so that's actually part of the law that they had. And so that's Jewish law. They're not allowed to do that. And that was a provision for the poor. And so the poor aren't going to get rich off of that. But it's one of those things where you think about some of the decisions that Ruth and Naomi had to make when they're coming back. They've heard that God has visited his people and that there's food in the land, but they're going, okay, well, there's a little bit of provision, knowing Naomi has some things to sell, but that's going to take a while. But they're going, hey, in the meantime, we've got this really interesting law in Israel that the poor, if you're willing to work hard, and humble yourself, you will have something to eat. And so that's the first way we see that God's law provides for Ruth and for the needy is just this simple law of like, well, hey, landowners aren't to pick up every scrap. They're to leave it for the poor. And so it provides for them for food. And again, it requires them to work hard, which provides for them in a different way, but that's part of it. That's the first place we see godly law making provision for the needy in the book, but in today's reading, we see it in probably a little more complicated way, and it's with this idea of the Redeemer or the Goel. And so there's this other law in the Old Testament, and it's in Deuteronomy 25, but this law of the Redeemer is a really interesting thing. And so I'm going to read this just part of this to you. It says this. It says, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And so again, that's the role of a goel, like we've already been talking about. And so, again, very strange law to us today. We don't see that, but it accomplished a couple things. And so, one, as this pointed out, it makes sure that family name goes on. Again, our culture doesn't seem to care about that nearly as much, but that was an important thing to them. Another thing this did was it really made the inheritance squared away. And so inheritance in a biblical sense was something that was a very important thing. We know wealth is gained from fathers. Well, it can't be gained if the inheritance if there's a confusion there, right? And so that's one of the things where we might look at this and go, okay, that's a really weird law, but I promise you this, ancient Israel was more squared away when it comes to inheritance than most Americans are today. Okay, and so it's one of these really strange things, and we'll see how it plays out. I know it's weird, but it absolutely provides for both Ruth and Naomi. And so let's go back to verse 10, because Boaz tells Ruth here, he says, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." And so he's saying, Ruth, this is a very kind thing that you are asking me to do. And it's not kind towards Boaz, it is, but that's not what he's referring to. He's talking about your first kindness towards Naomi, that was great. But this is an even greater kindness towards Naomi. That's what he's saying, that your first kindness towards her was good. This is even better. And so, again, he's surprised because, well, he's talking to a Moabite. So he'd be surprised that Ruth, coming from that culture, would do this. And we know that she's been kind to Naomi, taking care of her. But if Ruth would have married outside of the family, then she's no longer even related to Naomi, right? That's no longer her mother-in-law. That's her ex-mother-in-law at that point. And so that's not how it goes down here. And so what would have happened if Ruth would have married outside the family? Ruth probably would have been fine. But Naomi would have had to sell the land to just somebody random. It would have been a good one-time financial boost. But because she follows this law with the Goel, it means that Naomi stays as her mother-in-law, It means that her first son is going to be considered Naomi's grandson. And on top of that, not only is Ruth taking care of Naomi, but now Boaz and whatever future son she has is also going to be taking care of Naomi. Why? Because it keeps Naomi in the family and the inheritance together. And so it's a really strange law for us to try to wrap our heads around sometimes, but that idea of a Goel is like, no, this is actually bringing some redemption to the family, and not to mention the family name goes on. And so it's a really interesting thing, but that's why Boaz says this kindness is greater than the first. And it's simply because Ruth has started following God's law, and God's law provides for the needy. And so when she does this, when she truly starts to follow, like what I love about that is as a Gentile, she looks at that, and again, she can discern like, wait, that's good. Because even lots of us, when we read that, we go, I don't know if that's good. And what we do is we start usually thinking about personalities like, yeah, you don't know my husband's brother. Like, I don't want to marry that guy. But the idea of being taken care of is what is happening here. And so it's a interesting thing. But godly law makes provision for the needy. Here's number 2. It's this. It's that godly counsel is practical. Godly counsel is practical. And so I think we have all probably ran into some people who are giving godly counsel, and it ends up being more of philosophical nonsense. I don't know if you've ever seen that. Or you hear some type of message or instruction that you go, I don't even know what he's saying. And so that's not, I would say, godly counsel. It's foolishness. It's the tongue of the wise makes knowledge acceptable. And so we want to make sure that if we're giving godly counsel, at least people know what we're trying to say. And so Ruth, her goal in the chapter ends up becoming marrying Boaz. And again, it's kind of praised in Scripture as a good goal. And we know, again, a godly marriage is obviously a great goal. It's going to provide her with so many good things and so many blessings just by God's design. But what Naomi points out at the beginning of the chapter is like, hey, this will give you rest. You're working really hard to provide for you and me. A godly marriage is going to provide you with rest, and which of course rings true today. But Naomi gives her some counsel here with the idea that, hey, Boaz is the guy that you should marry. And again, the counsel is so practical, where Ruth would have all types of questions about the law, about how the Goel and all that stuff works, the Redeemer stuff, and Naomi's going to be able to answer that. But Naomi knows the culture. She knows that he's going to be winnowing barley at the threshing floor, and she gives Ruth some advice here of how to approach Boaz. And so this is going to be probably more forward than we see most women at the time. But Ruth, again, also in a weird spot. Nobody's going to guess that a Moabite woman would be familiar with these laws about a redeemer. And so here's what Naomi tells her back in verse 3. She says, "Wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say, I will do." And so, again, very practical advice. If someone over-spiritualizes this, they'd say something, well, hey, if this is the man that is supposed to be your husband, then God's going to make it happen. And that's not what Naomi says. She says, hey, you've been working in the fields? Why don't you go take a bath? Go clean your face, put on your nice clothes. In fact, he's going to be feasting, and so wait till he's got a full belly, and he's happy, and then after you're looking good, you're smelling good, and he's full and happy, then we can approach him, right? And so again, not an over-spiritualized conversation, but good godly counsel, right? That idea that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, ladies. Amen. Hey, and so, yes, and so that's so true here, but she just gives this super practical advice, and Ruth trusts her, knowing, oh, okay, hey, like, man, I just love that relationship. She just goes, okay, everything you've said, I'll do. I don't necessarily understand it, but it's very practical, godly counsel. And so I think what happens is sometimes when we read that, we know this verse from 1 Peter chapter 3. We'll put that on the screen real quick. But I think sometimes we might take this verse out of context. It says this, it says, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and putting on gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, in which in God's sight is very precious. And so I love this verse. This is great counsel. I want my daughters to know this verse. Like, man, it's needs to be that hidden person of you that is attractive, but it's not saying don't be feminine. It's not saying don't look good. It's not saying don't smell good. It's saying, no, the main thing that you want to attract men with is of course, your character. And so, again, as we read through this story, we already know that that's been the case with Boaz. He has noticed Ruth's character throughout the whole story. In fact, he points it out multiple times that he's very impressed with her. That's what has attracted him initially to her. In fact, I think that's one of the important things. A godly character in one person will attract a person of another who's trying to have godly character, right? That's going to go hand in hand. But, again, the counsel that she gets is, yes, your godly character is attractive to Boaz, but make sure you smell good, okay? And so I love it, and that's what she listens to it. She listens to that counsel, and that kind of leads us to number 3, and it's this. It's that godly paths take courage. They require courage. And so we see that all throughout the scripture. We saw that in the story of Rahab. Again, it's by courage that she's able to follow the Lord and make God her God. Of course, we can look at any of the war stories. We think of David. Yes, those things require courage. But even all the way to someone who's just trying to live a godly life like Ruth, no, all of those things require courage. And this situation absolutely does. Here's a good quote for you from C.S. Lewis. It says this. It says, where courage is not, no other virtue can survive except by accident. Right? That's every Bible story. That's anyone who's ever done anything of any type of spiritual significance. There is courage behind it. And so I love that quote, and really that's just a fancier and better way of saying my point, that godly paths require courage. And so I want you to think about Ruth and what she's trying to do here. So Ruth, she's going into Boaz, and she is literally making a marriage proposal. Okay, it doesn't seem like she's known him very long. That takes courage. And there's another very practical thing that Naomi tells her to do here that maybe of everything might seem weirder than anything in the story, but she tells Ruth to go in, uncover his feet, and lay there at his feet. That's weird, okay? And let me just say, in the culture at the time, it was still weird, okay? That's not normal. This isn't like, hey, well, back in ancient Israel, women would often, no, this is not a normal thing that people would do. This is actually very practical advice. And so again, we've already talked about how hey, he's in a good place to listen. He's happy, he's full, she's smelling good. But what happens is while he goes to sleep, she uncovers his feet, and then she lays down at his feet. It's not a provocative thing. The provocative counsel would be like, hey, go snuggle up next to him, okay? No, what all this is, hey, uncover his feet. At some point in the night, it's going to wake him up because his feet are going to get cold. He looks at your feet, and there you are. And so there's Ruth, and now she's actually for the first time able to have a one-on-one conversation. Let's just read that part real quick. It says, and when Boaz had eaten and drunk, this is verse 7, when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And again, now it's time for this conversation, which takes a lot of courage. The idea of proposing to a man takes courage, okay? That's a weird thing. But she says, Boaz, paraphrasing, I understand how your law works. I understand how this idea of the Goel, of the Redeemer, works. I want you to marry me. And so if you want to talk about putting yourself out there, this is it, right? This is, there's so many things, so many other ways this could have gone. He could have simply said no. It seems like they might have been part of a different social class even at the time. He could have just been like, no, I don't want my first child to have anything to do with your first husband, and for him to have that name at all. There's a lot of reasons he could have said no. And so, yes, this is super forward. And I think it's also easy to look at it and go, well, if godly past take courage, why didn't Boaz take the initiative? And I look at that, and I think for probably a couple reasons here. And so one might be her age. It seems like he's quite a bit older. It's hard to tell, but there's probably a difference in maybe even how he looks. Maybe she seems out of his league, whether that's by age or by looks, I don't know. Another thing that it could have been the whole Moabite thing, just going, well, like she's from a pagan culture. She doesn't know anything about what our laws are. Like she's not going to come here and know what a Goel is and want to try this whole kinsman redeemer path. Like why would I pursue that? But I think the main thing is one of the things he says, no, there's actually a redeemer closer than I. And so there's another person that's part of Naomi's family that I would say has dibs, like that is closer relationally, that should be the Goel, that should be the Redeemer. And so I think that's interesting because one of the things we know is like, okay, here's Boaz gets woken up at midnight, and now he's having a very deep conversation, and we see like, well, no, he's already scoped this out. Like he's interested. He's very interested in Ruth. In fact, he's like, well, I've actually looked into it. There is someone in our family line that is legally speaking closer and should be the kinsman redeemer, should be the Goel. And so that's what's going on here. And so I love that because we see that Boaz is very interested in Ruth, like we talked about at the beginning. Boaz doesn't care about the property. Boaz cares about Ruth, and that's who he's going to pursue next week. But it absolutely took courage for Ruth to make this marriage proposal. So I'm going to have Robert come up and play a song for us. I'm not going to sing to you like Pastor Jake does, but I wish I could. And so with that, just during this time of invitation, I want you to just think about how good of a picture this is. How good of a picture it is when we think about just someone coming to the Lord. That this story, like so many stories in the Scripture, is a physical representation of a spiritual reality. And so Boaz being the Redeemer, and I'm sure we'll look into it more next week, but again, Ruth's eyes have been opened. She knows she needs to be redeemed. It's been revealed to her that this is the truth. And so just generally speaking, I would say that those people who walk through really hard times tend to find themselves in a place where they should be humble enough to have their ears opened. I think you might know what I'm talking about. You might say, man, I couldn't hear what anyone said until I finally reached a place of humility. I think of the prodigal son, this story about this guy who was as proud as a young man ever has been, and he goes off, he starts living life like he thinks he should, until he finally falls on hard time because of his own behavior, and that destruction that he brings on himself brings him to a place of humility, and now he's finally got his ears opened. And so as people go through hard times, like Rahab, like Ruth, those things should be the thing that brings us to a place of humility where we can actually hear from the Lord. And that's what I love so much about this picture of the Redeemer here with Ruth, is she's able to recognize, like we said in point one, no, God's law, like that provides for me. And then she starts listening to godly counsel, and then all that's left is actually walking the path. We know it's going to take courage. And so I don't know where everyone is today. Maybe you're at a place where you're going, I'm going through something hard right now, but I think I'm finally humble enough to come to the Lord and make God my God. Maybe that's you. I know a lot of y'all have been in church for a long time. Maybe you're going, you know what? Actually, I know the Lord very well, and I've received counsel on something. I know what my next steps are and the path that I'm supposed to take, but I'm scared. And it's going to take courage for me to do that. And so, again, I don't know where you are as with all the different things we've covered today, but if God's your God, He's worth it. He wants to provide for you. He loves you. If you've never made Him your God, then I would just ask you, like, man, why? Why not? Are you here today knowing that that's something you need to do? Here today because you know that, no, I need to make God my God, and I need Him to save me and to provide for me, because all I bring on myself is just hardship. And so if that's you, I'd love to talk with you during this time. Maybe you've just been visiting our church a long time, and you want to join today. Hey, that's great. This is a time you can do that too, but we're going to stand for a time of invitation. Tyson's going to lead us in a song, and then we'll get out of here.